In this video, we will discuss the interwar period from 1921 to 1941. While the world is recovering from the Great War, the U.S. is returning to its isolationist roots. Germany, Italy, and Japan are growing their empires, pushing the world into a second major conflict. This period ends with the attack on Pearl Harbor, thrusting the U.S. into World War II. The peace treaty ending World War I caused more problems than it solved, and laid the basis for World War II. Old empires were split up into new countries, most of which without any regard to culture. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was dissolved and new nations were created: Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. The Ottoman Turks had to give up most of their land in Southwest Asia and the Middle East. In Europe, the Ottoman Empire became Turkey. Poland, which had been divided among Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary, was reformed. Russia, now the Soviet Union, lost territory that became Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Russia and Austria-Hungary also lost territory to Poland and Romania. Between 1921 and 1922, the world's largest naval powers gathered in Washington, D.C. for a conference to discuss disarmament and ways to relieve tensions in East Asia. After World War I, U.S. officials and private citizens made significant efforts to guarantee that the nation would not be drawn into another war. In 1921, U.S. Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes invited 9 nations to Washington, D.C. to discuss naval reductions and the situation in the Far East. 3 major treaties were signed at the Washington Naval Conference. The 5-Power Treaty, signed by the U.S., Britain, Japan, France, and Italy, limited the number of warships in their navies. The 4-Power Treaty, signed by the U.S., France, Britain, and Japan, required each nation to consult with each other in the event of a crisis in East Asia. The 9-Power Treaty made the open-door policy part of international law, respecting the territorial integrity of China. In total, the 3 treaties allowed the U.S. to continue its policies in Asia and limit Japanese expansion in the region as much as possible. In 1928, France proposed a joint agreement between the U.S. and France to outlaw war between the two countries. President Calvin Coolidge was worried that the agreement against war would be interpreted as an alliance and required the United States to intervene if France was ever threatened. To avoid this, the U.S. suggested that the two nations take the lead in inviting all nations to join them in outlawing war. The Kellogg-Briand Pact, signed by 62 nations, had 2 clauses. The first outlawed war as a tool of national policy, and the second called upon those nations to settle their disputes by peaceful means. In the years following the First World War, issues of debt repayment and reparations troubled relations between the Allies and the now defeated Germany. The U.S.-sponsored Dawes and Young plans offered a possible solution to these challenges. At the end of the First World War, the victorious European powers demanded that Germany pay them for the devastation of the Great War, for which they held Germany and its allies responsible. At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, the Allies set their reparations at 132 billion gold marks, or approximately $31.5 billion. Germany defaulted on a payment in January of 1923. Inflation in Germany, which had begun to accelerate in 1922, spiraled into hyperinflation. While the U.S. had little interest in collecting reparations from Germany, it was determined to secure repayment of the more than $10 billion it had loaned the Allies over the course of the war. The U.S. came up with a plan. Under the Dawes Plan, Germany's annual reparation payments would be reduced, increasing over time as its economy improved. Over the next 4 years, U.S. banks continued to lend Germany enough money to enable it to meet its reparation payments to countries such as France and the U.K. These countries in turn used their reparation payments from Germany to pay their war debts to the U.S. A major cause of World War II was the rise of dictatorships. In Russia, hopes for a democracy gave way to civil war, resulting in the establishment of a communist state called the USSR, or the Soviet Union. When Joseph Stalin came into power, he took complete control of the country and made agricultural and industrial growth the prime economic goals. By 1937, Stalin was able to transform the USSR from a backwards rural country into the second largest industrial power in the world. In his drive to purge anyone who threatened his power, Stalin had 8 to 13 million of his own people killed. By 1939, he had established a totalitarian government. While Stalin was consolidating his power in the Soviet Union, the Italians were dealing with their own economic depression in 1922, and were worried that communists might take over their country as well. This gave rise to another totalitarian, Benito Mussolini. Amid growing violence and chaos in Italy, King Victor Emmanuel dissolved parliament and held elections, where Mussolini was elected to parliament. Then King Emmanuel dissolved the government and asked Mussolini to form its own new government. He became known as Il Duce, or the leader. He was the first to create a fascist country. He declared himself dictator in January 1925. In Germany, Adolf Hitler had followed a similar path to power as Mussolini. Germany's Great Depression began right after World War I. It was in this chaotic atmosphere that a jobless Hitler joined the National Socialist German Workers' Party. He quickly became the party leader because he was a powerful public speaker. He called himself Der Führer, also the leader. He had his own private army known as the Stormtroopers, or the Brown Shirts. In his book Mein Kampf, he set forth his basic beliefs of Nazism, which is just the German form of fascism. In 1936, a group of Spanish army officers led by General Francisco Franco rebelled against the Spanish Republic. This led to the Spanish Civil War. Trying to stop the spread of fascism, 3,000 Americans, known as the Abraham Lincoln Battalion, traveled to Spain to fight Franco. The Western powers, however, remained neutral, while Mussolini and Hitler sent troops, tanks, planes, and weapons. In 1939, after 500,000 deaths, Franco was able to establish another totalitarian government in Europe. Finally, in Japan, militarists took control of the government. Militarists are those who believe in a strong army, navy, or air force as the most important goal for the nation. All society should be geared towards creating a strong military, who would run the government and use force to achieve its goals. They wanted to return the emperor to power. They disliked democracy and wanted Japan to remove European colonial powers and rule Asia themselves by creating the East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. They were supported by many Japanese business leaders. Eventually, their leaders would be General Hideki Tojo and Emperor Hirohito. In September of 1931, the Japanese invaded the Chinese province of Manchuria. They wanted raw materials to fuel their growing industrial capacity. They established a puppet government and renamed it Manchukuo. The League of Nations denounced the invasion, prompting Japan to quit the League. Nothing else was done to Japan. The invasion violated the open door policy with China. The U.S. responded with the Stimson Doctrine. It declared that the U.S. refused to recognize the legitimacy of the Japanese puppet regime in Manchuria since it was established by force. The League of Nations soon followed with a similar declaration. The Washington Conference, Kellogg-Briand Pact, and the Stimson Doctrine all failed to stop any of the aggressor nations leading up to World War II because they lacked any punishment for nations that broke the treaties. This lack of teeth in condemning violators shows the U.S. wish to remain isolationist. If they showed any real consequences, the U.S. might have to intervene when those treaties were violated. Hitler learned that if he could conquer the other lands without any real consequences from the League or Western nations. FDR drastically changed U.S. foreign policy towards Latin America with a good neighbor policy. Its most important principles were non-intervention and non-interference. This essentially means that the U.S. would leave domestic affairs in Latin America to themselves. Most importantly, the new American policy would be against armed intervention. Being a good neighbor also meant that the U.S. would make more of an effort to engage in economic deals and exchanges with Latin American nations. The Roosevelt administration's goal was to reassert American presence in Latin American affairs and restore their reputation as a valuable ally through reciprocal trade agreements. Plus, acting like a good neighbor would have the bonus of hemispheric unity. The U.S. citizens would hopefully have a more open mind towards Central and South Americans. As a demonstration of the U.S. commitment to being a good neighbor who stays in his own yard, U.S. Marines were withdrawn from Haiti and Nicaragua. In addition, FDR developed more generous policies of immigration to the U.S., especially from Mexico. FDR also annulled the Platt Amendment, a way the U.S. could dominate affairs in Cuba after the Spanish-American War. Despite annulling the Platt Amendment, the U.S. did continue its lease at Guantanamo Bay. Senator Nye from North Dakota formed a committee in 1936 to investigate the actions of bankers and munition makers from 1914 to 1918. The Nye report convinced millions of citizens that bankers who had lent money to the European allies had been the merchants of death and had tricked the country into war because they wanted to make a profit at any cost. This will become the basis of U.S. foreign policy as Europe and Asia get closer to conflict. The Nye Committee led to the passage of the Johnson Debt Default Act. After the stock market crash and U.S. loan money dried up, Germany wasn't able to pay off its reparations to the Allies. They in turn were not able to pay off their World War I loans. We were angry with the ungrateful and defaulting debtors. The law prevented nations that owed us money from World War I loans from borrowing further from the USA. If attacked again by aggressors, these delinquents would stew in their own juices. Ethiopia, one of only two independent African nations at the time, was invaded on October 3, 1935 by fascist Italy under Benito Mussolini. Italy had tried in the 1890s to conquer Ethiopia, but failed. A border incident between Ethiopia and Somaliland gave Mussolini an excuse to invade. The invading Italian force steadily pushed back the poorly armed, ill-trained Ethiopian army, until capturing the capital in May of 1936. The League of Nations condemned the invasion and imposed economic sanctions, which were largely ineffective. It contributed to rising international tensions between the fascist states and the Western democracies. Meanwhile, in the U.S., President Roosevelt is nervously watching the events of Europe unfold, knowing all along that the U.S. would have to get involved. Unfortunately, the public was not interested in another European conflict. Congress reflected this sentiment by passing a series of neutrality acts in an effort to prevent the U.S. from repeating the mistakes of the past. The Neutrality Act of 1935 was passed after Italy's invasion of Ethiopia. It placed an embargo on trading war materials. The Neutrality Act of 1936 banned loans to any country at war. This was done to prevent what happened before World War I, when the U.S. loaned the Allies $10 billion. The Neutrality Act of 1937 banned the transport of American passengers to countries at war. This was clearly in reference to the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915. The Neutrality Act of 1939 banned American ships from entering war zones to prevent the German U-boats from sinking them and killing innocent Americans. In 1937, FDR saw the aggression of Italy, Japan, and Germany as a potential threat to world peace. In a speech given in Chicago, he called for a quarantine of aggressor nations. While not naming the countries, he said that those countries were building up their military quickly. FDR pushed back against the American policy of neutrality and isolationism that was heavily supported by Congress and the American people. Roosevelt's speech was met with heavy criticism, and it only strengthened the isolationist mood of the country. About 3 million German-speaking people live in the western border region of Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland, the light brown area on the map. This mountainous region was Czechoslovakia's main defense against Germany. Hitler used propaganda to spread lies that the Czechs were abusing and murdering Sudeten Germans. Early in the crisis, both England and France had vowed to protect Czechoslovakia. When war seemed inevitable, Hitler invited their two leaders to Munich to meet with him. Once there, he promised that he would stop Germans' expansion if they gave him the Sudetenland. Eager to avoid war, they agreed in what is known as the Munich Agreement. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain came back to Britain triumphantly declaring, "It is peace in our time." British opposition leader Winston Churchill saw it differently. He called what the French and British had just done appeasement. They gave up their principles to pacify an aggressor. He warned that they may have temporarily avoided war, but that wouldn't stop Hitler. He would continue to try to expand, and eventually they would have to go to war. On March 15, 1939, German troops poured into the Czech heartland. By nightfall, Hitler boasted that Czechoslovakia has ceased to exist. Hitler had now added the German countries of Austria and Czechoslovakia to the Third Reich and set his sights on Poland.